Hello all, in this video we will go through a research paper titled Linguistic Ambiguity Analysis in ChatGPT. So what exactly is linguistic ambiguity? So in natural language processing we deal with texts or sentences, and in certain scenarios or instances we come across texts which have multiple interpretations. So for example, I went to the bank. So over here the particular lemma bank has multiple meaning. So it is not only difficult for humans to correctly understand that particular sentence, but it is also difficult for artificial intelligence systems too. In the second part we have ChatGPT, which is a model which is trained on GPT-3, which is a modern transformer architecture which has multiple millions of parameters. It essentially interacts with humans or users, and through a prompting and a human user feedback manner, and it's quite efficient as it is trained on large language data. Now let's look at the abstract of the paper. Linguistic ambiguity is and always been one of the main challenges in NLP systems. Modern transformer architectures like BERT, T5, or more recently InstructGPT have achieved some impressive improvements in many NLP fields, but there's still plenty of work to do. Motivated by the uproar caused by ChatGPT, in this paper we provide an introduction to linguistic ambiguity, its varieties, and their relevance in modern NLP, and perform an extensive empiric analysis. ChatGPT's strengths and weaknesses are revealed, as well as strategies to get the most of this model. So essentially, as we know that old and basic embedding architectures were not that well with respect to linguistic ambiguity, as they really couldn't extract the meaningful representation from the sentences, whereas the modern transformer architectures like BERT, T5, as they're trained on large language data, are sort of have a good impressive improvement compared to them. So in this particular paper we are trying to see how ChatGPT responds to linguistic ambiguity. Now let's look at the different types of ambiguities which are discussed in the paper. So the different types of ambiguities are phonetics, morphology, lexical, syntax, semantics, pragmatics, and discourse. But the three which are discussed quite extensively in the paper are lexical, syntax, and semantics. Now lexical ambiguity is a type of ambiguity which deals with a single word or a token in an entire sentence. So there are two different representations, homonymy and polysemy. Now in homonymy we have two words that have come to the same form, that is, they either have the same spelling or same pronunciation but have different meaning. For example, I went to the bank. Now bank can have two different meanings. It could either mean financial business or an area next to the river. In polysemy we have one word that has several meanings. For example, to serve could either mean to serve a tea or to serve time in prison. In syntactic ambiguity we deal with a group of words rather than a single word. Now the group of words makes the sentence have multiple interpretations. So for example, Mary saw John with a telescope. Now here with a telescope makes the sentence have multiple meanings. So it could either mean Mary used a telescope to see John, or it could also mean John was carrying a telescope when Mary saw him. Now in semantic ambiguity, it is basically caused when a sentence has lack of context. For example, my mother and my sister were sad after she shouted at her. Now we can clearly see that there's a lack of resolution of the pronouns which are used in the sentence. So we basically don't know who she and her refers to in this particular sentence. Now let's look at the experimental setup and analysis to see how ChatGPT deals with ambiguity. In order to do that, the researchers basically input some ambiguous sentences via prompting and analyze ChatGPT outputs. The main question is for sentence whether ChatGPT detects the presence or absence of ambiguity. Now we will look at the experiment parameters in more detail with respect to each ambiguity. So first of all, we'll look at homonymy, lexical ambiguity. So the different types of prompts are given to the ChatGPT model in order to analyze the outputs. So first off we have, is the sentence ambiguous? Secondly, what does every occurrence of the word mean in the sentence? And finally, in certain scenarios, the prompt is modified in order to check improvements in the outputs. So the first input is, how does a bear bear with the pain? And the output is bears are able to bear with pain in much the same way as humans do through a combination of natural defenses and behavior. So you can see that the model is able to quite understand the question really well, and the output reflects it. And the second sentence is the sentence, how does a bear bear with the pain, ambiguous? And the output is yes, the sentence, how does a bear bear with the pain, is ambiguous because it can be interpreted in two different ways. One interpretation is asking about the physical process by which a bear copes with the pain, while the other interpretation is asking about the emotional process. So you can see that although our main goal is to make ChatGPT identify homonymy, it tries to predict polysemy over here by focusing on the second word, a bear, which is a verb, and tries to link it to two different types of bearings, which are physical and emotional. So it's sort of a false positive, because polysemy essentially makes a sentence ambiguous because it is a single word which has multiple interpretations. So although our goal is to make it identify homonymy, it predicts polysemy. Now the third prompt is, what does bear mean in the sentence, how does a bear bear with the pain? The output is, in the sentence, how does a bear bear with the pain, the word bear is being used as a verb. It means to tolerate or endure something difficult or unpleasant. So again, it identifies the second word bear, which is a verb, and not the first bear. And finally, if the prompt is modified more efficiently, let's look at the output. So the prompt basically is, in the sentence, how does a bear bear with the pain, what does every word bear mean? And the output is, in the sentence, how does a bear bear with the pain, there are two instances of the word bear. The first instance of the word bear is a noun that refers to a large carnivorous mammal that is native to the northern regions of North America, Europe, and Asia. The second instance of the word bear is a verb that means tolerate, endure something. So as you can see that it is able to identify both the meanings of the word bear, but for that we had to really modify the prompt, and then it was able to identify homonymy. Now let's look at polysemy, lexical ambiguity. Again, the first prompt is the sentence ambiguous? And the second task is different because the goal over here is to identify definition classification. So basically two different definitions of the lemma are given, and the prompt is asked, that is, which of the definitions appear in the sentence. The third prompt is, in the sentence which is the definition of lemma. And in the fourth prompt, a collection of ambiguous sentences are used, and a prompt is generated, that is the sentence ambiguous? And finally, the last experiment is to try to confuse ChatGPT using erroneous lemma definitions. And the result of these experiments are that ChatGPT correctly detects non-ambiguity in all of the 10 sentences which are used. And for the second experiment, an example is used, that is, for a specific lemma, to serve, there are two different definitions: to provide food or drinks, and the second definition is to work for, to do your duty to. And a prompt is generated, that is, she has served on the committee for the last 15 years. And for this experiment, ChatGPT correctly classifies the definition, but it only fails on one particular lemma, that is to cheat. Moving on, let's look at the syntactic ambiguity experiment. Again, the first prompt is the sentence ambiguous? The second prompt being, how do you interpret the sentence? And in some cases, the ChatGPT is given an ambiguous clause, and the prompt model is the sentence in the sentence is the clause ambiguous? The input to the model is, how do you interpret the sentence, Mary saw John with a telescope? And the output is, to interpret the sentence, Mary saw John with a telescope, it means that Mary used a telescope to see John. The sentence could be rephrased as, Mary used a telescope to see John. So you can clearly see that the ChatGPT model is not able to correctly identify ambiguity, although there is syntactic ambiguity present in the sentence. The second prompt is the sentence, Mary saw John with a telescope, ambiguous? No, the sentence Mary saw John with a telescope is not ambiguous. So again, it doesn't identify any ambiguity. What does with a telescope mean in the sentence? In the sentence Mary saw John with a telescope, the phrase with a telescope means that Mary used a telescope to see John. It indicates that the telescope was the means or instrument through which Mary saw John. Again, there is no identification or any proof of ambiguity. The fourth prompt is, in the sentence Mary saw John with a telescope, is with a telescope ambiguous? In the sentence Mary saw John with a telescope, the phrase with a telescope is not ambiguous. So still it is not able to identify any sort of ambiguity, although we have modified the prompt in such a way such that it should be able to identify syntactic ambiguity. The fifth prompt is, isn't then with a telescope ambiguous? And the output is, it is possible that the phrase with a telescope could be ambiguous in some contexts depending on the intended meaning of the sentence and the specific words used. So finally, when the prompt is modified in such a fashion, it is able to finally identify ambiguity. And then final prompt is the sentence Mary saw John with a telescope ambiguous? Now, compared to the second prompt, is the sentence Mary saw John with a telescope ambiguous? Over here the model straight up predicted the value to be no, but over here, given a particular context, it doesn't predict no directly, rather tells that it is not necessarily ambiguous. Now going to the semantic ambiguity experiment. The first prompt is the sentence ambiguous? And finally they explore other specific prompts to analyze the reference of the ambiguous pronouns. Over here the first prompt is the sentence my mother and my sister were sad after she shouted at her ambiguous? Yes, the sentence my mother and my sister were sad after she shouted at her is ambiguous. Without more context, it is unclear which person is being referred to as she and who was shouted at by her. So it is quite amazing to see that ChatGPT model is able to correctly identify semantic ambiguity in a particular prompt. The second input is, in the sentence my mother and my sister were sad after she shouted at her, who shouted at who? And the output is, in the sentence my mother and my sister were sad after she shouted at her, it is not clear who shouted at whom. The pronoun she could refer to either the speaker's mother or sister, and the pronoun her could refer to either the person who was shouted at or the person doing the shouting. So again, it's quite good to see that it is able to identify semantic ambiguity for the pronouns which are used in a sentence. Now let's look at a few other examples. So here in the sentence, the physicist hired the secretary because she was overwhelmed with the work. Who the pronoun she refers to? And the output is the pronoun she refers to the secretary. And the next input is, in the sentence the physicist hired the secretary because she was overwhelmed with work. Who the pronoun he refers to? And the output is the pronoun he refers to the physicist. So although the ChatGPT model is quite good at identifying semantic ambiguity with respect to the pronouns in the sentence, it sort of puts gender bias over the grammar used in certain situations. So that is quite strange to see. The researchers also focused on certain tasks with respect to ambiguity generation. So essentially they asked the ChatGPT model to generate an ambiguous sentence. So it generated this particular sentence, which is, the chicken is ready to eat. So as you can see, it's quite ambiguous because it has multiple interpretations. First off, the chicken has been cooked and is now ready to be eaten. And the second interpretation is the chicken is so hungry that is ready to eat something else. But interestingly, when the same ambiguous statement was sent to the model again, the output was quite interesting. it said that the sentence "the chicken is ready to eat" is not inherently ambiguous. So that is quite strange, and it sort of shows lack of consistency of the ChatGPT model and lack of self-confidence too. Now let's look at the result at each experiment category. In the case of homonymy lexical ambiguity experiment, the number which really stands out is false positive. And that is because although the experiment was related to homonymy, the model predicted that particular sentence to be polysemous, because polysemy is something which makes the entire sentence ambiguous, and that is why it's a false positive, because the model predicts something to be ambiguous but in reality it is unambiguous. The second category is polysemy. Nearly 10 out of the 12 input prompts were correctly classified. In syntactic ambiguity, 2 out of the 5 input prompts were correctly classified, that too upon efficient prompt input. And in the case of semantic ambiguity, all of the 3 input examples were correctly classified in the respective ambiguous and unambiguous categories. In summary, ChatGPT is remarkably good at classifying meaning of polysemous words in non-ambiguous sentences, even when the definitions are not in the context. In ambiguous sentences, ChatGPT does not seem to perform as good as for homonymy, but results improve with better prompting. Syntactic ambiguity is the hardest to detect with ChatGPT, but with better prompting and human feedback, ambiguity detection is visible. And finally, ChatGPT does some amazing job detecting ambiguous pronouns in co-reference resolution situations, but disappointingly fails putting gender bias over grammar in situations where this grammar makes a sentence non-ambiguous. So that's it really. See you all in the next video.